Welcome to TrustTalk. Our guest today is Richard Ned Lebow, emeritus professor of international political theory in the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. He explores whether trust can endure in a world of shifting alliances and escalating global tensions. NATO faces unprecedented challenges. Europe grapples with its security role, and the United States reevaluates its commitments. All while conflicts in Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza continue to unfold. Adding to this volatile landscape is the rising tension between China and Taiwan, a flashpoint with far-reaching implications for global stability. We examine the fragile dynamics of transatlantic trust, the concept of European strategic autonomy, and the historical lessons that could guide us through this unstable era. Join us as we uncover the geopolitical realities shaping the future of global security and trust. Your host, Severin DeWitt.
Ned, welcome back to TrustTalk. The last time we spoke was in February 2022 when you shared your insights on international relations, diplomacy and trust. I'm pleased to tell you that your episode remains one of our top 5 most listened to interviews. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us again.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to hear that people have found my interview interesting and very pleased to be with you again.
Let's start off. My first question relates to trust and alliances. With Donald Trump re-elected as the 47th president of the US, European leaders might question whether they can still rely on the US as a steadfast ally. In your view, has the transatlantic trust eroded to a point of no return, or is there a foundation strong enough to withstand these strains?
So the answer is both. That certainly under Trump, trust has disappeared. I mean, why would you trust a man like Trump who lies through his teeth, who does one thing today, something else tomorrow, and doesn't even remember what he did last time around? He's unpredictable, he's dangerous, he's self-centered, and a psychopath.
Oh, wow. That's clear.
Well, I think there's no clinical evidence is clear, and we're speaking now in the shadow of the election. So your audience should know this. He's just announced some of his more important cabinet picks. Each one, according to one of his Republican supporters, would have been the worst cabinet appointment in the history of the United States. And collectively, it boggles the mind. Why has he chosen these people? He's chosen them not because they're qualified, quite the reverse. He's chosen them because they're in the face of his enemies. He basically admitted this in an interview. So here's a man whose primary responsibility as president is looking after the country, whose primary goal personally is going after his enemies. And the country will pay the price. So will the NATO alliance. It's very clear here that we're in for 4 very difficult years, and difficult years in a very difficult period for NATO, given the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. That's the negative answer. The positive answer is, with any luck, Trump is like a bad tropical storm that passes over, does a lot of damage, but you can rebuild in its aftermath. I'm hoping that he proves so bad, in a way like the Tories in Britain, that he and the Republicans are ultimately swept out of office and Atlantic ties can be rebuilt. That's my hope.
Talking about those ties, with Trump's second term likely to bring a reduced US role in Europe, do you see this as an opportunity for Europe to step up its security responsibilities, or can it lead to a weakening of the transatlantic alliance?
The first question, is it really true that his interest and America's role in Europe will be diminished? The reverse is also possible, with Trump putting great pressure on Europeans to pay more, put more money into NATO. Yes, why not? Why wouldn't he repeat that policy? Which may not altogether be a bad thing, because given the threats Europe faces, putting more money into defense, particularly in countries where the percentage of spending is very low, may be a good idea, maybe a way of achieving two goals: of buying Trump off, getting him off your back, but at the same time, improving your defense. And if you add, what if Europeans collectively agreed to do this in return for Trump continuing support of Ukraine? There's some bargaining leverage here for Europe.
In Europe, we often talk about what's called strategic autonomy. It has been met with both support and resistance in the US. How feasible do you think it's for Europe to build its own defense capability without the US support, and what challenges would need to be overcome?
Well, the question is whether Europe can develop solidarity and a common defense policy with or without the US. It seems to me that most of the obstacles to this are European, not American. Europe is divided. Europe's always been divided, even at times where the French and the Germans agreed and were the powerhouses in Europe. A common European foreign and defense policy never developed. So it's probably much less likely now.
You mentioned NATO. How has NATO's role in fostering trust between Europe and the US evolved with the recent conflicts in Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza? Do you foresee any shifts in Europe's reliance on NATO or its willingness to look elsewhere for security partnerships?
I'm not sure where else it could look for a security partnership. Not to Russia, not to China.
No, for sure.
Britain is already involved in that sense. That's not going to change. The Scandinavian countries, Finland and Sweden, are now coming into NATO, which is positive. The Europeans have to look to themselves. This is a serious issue. And again, it's both a danger and an opportunity. If they don't, they're in deeper trouble. If they do, they're stronger. And again, if they are able to get their act together and build some kind of common policy, they have greater leverage with Washington. So it's in their interest. On the other hand, what are you going to do when you have leaders in countries like Hungary and Slovakia who are fundamentally pro-Russian? You have to find a way around that. Until this point, people off record curse Orban, the leaders, but in practice, they let him get away with everything, including a fairly recent trip to Georgia, where he acted as if he were a spokesman for the EU, pushing a pro-Russian policy. So the first place to start is with people like this, and I don't see the will in Europe to do that, alas.
There's a call for Europe to establish what is called its own pillar within NATO. What would be required for Europe to organize and finance such a pillar effectively? And can this potentially lead to a redefined NATO structure?
This comes back to what we've been talking about. And it requires two things: more expenditure on security at a time when there are other demands on economics and economies are struggling. So this is very tough to pull off politically, to get people to pay more for the military. And secondly, there has to be agreement about what a common defense and foreign policy should do. You really can't have one without the other. They have to be related components. And this is a very hard task. I remember back in the 1960s, talks began among Europeans for developing a common foreign policy. And pro-European analysts were always in favor of this. It never got anywhere, and I don't see that changing, especially given the kinds of constraints that have already been mentioned.
An abrupt US pullback could leave Europe fragmented and potentially create a security vacuum. What steps should Europe take to prepare for such a scenario? And do you think a managed transition would prevent a destabilizing effect on European security?
How shall I put this? I don't have a kind word to say about Putin and Russian foreign policy. At the same time, it's clear that in Ukraine, he's bitten off more than he can chew. In the circumstances, Russia is not now, nor will it be in the future, in a position to threaten any NATO state. So, in this sense, the fears of conventional, even more of nuclear war, are greatly exaggerated. That said, those fears are real in the sense that people are worried, and it provides an opportunity which is not likely to happen again, at least I hope it won't happen again, for European leaders to mobilize public support behind some common policy. You asked what that policy should be. It should consist in the first instance of agreement across the board about what percentage of national income should be spent on defense, with the allowance of some exceptions depending on the country. Secondly, there should be much more integrated training. Common exercises, which already exist, should be increased. And Europeans, and perhaps this is already happening, should be making defense plans with the scenario that they have American support and the scenario that they don't. If you could do that and combine it with at least a semblance of a common foreign policy, you would send a very strong signal both to Moscow and Washington. The foreign policy is more difficult because people pull in very different directions depending on their geographical location and the nature of their energy supplies, on energy, on immigration, on opposing Russia and supporting Ukraine. These issues, until now, have been dealt with separately. And dealing with them separately tends to emphasize the differences. If you could deal with them collectively, it allows for the possibility of trade-offs. And with trade-offs, you have a much greater chance of reaching some common understanding on all these issues. That's what I would recommend.
The Israel-Gaza conflict, the situation in Lebanon and volatile situation in nearby regions is once again putting global trust to the test. What role do you think the US and Europe should play in these conflicts, and how might this impact their trust in one another's decisions?
Well, let's start with trust and mistrust in the Middle East. Mistrust is probably at the highest level it ever has been. The chance of getting any kind of agreement between Israel and Palestinians seems extremely unlikely. By agreement, I'm not talking here of a permanent settlement. At the moment, that's a pipe dream, but some kind of agreement that allows everyday life to resume on both sides with minimum expectations of violence. That clearly has to be the first step now, in contrast to expectations in the past that you might be able to pull off some kind of real settlement. That's problem number one. Number two is that trust between the participants and outsiders is some way at a low point, except, I suspect, for the Trump-Netanyahu relationship. The kinds of people that Trump surrounds himself with, and the new ambassador to Israel and to the United Nations, basically are prepared to let Netanyahu do whatever he wants. So This encourages Netanyahu rather than restraining him. At the same time, Hamas and Palestinians more generally have been able to mobilize considerable support in Europe and to some extent in the US as well. Rather than restraining Hamas and Palestinians, this goads them on. So both the combatants, rather than being restrained and pulled in by third parties on whom they, to varying degrees, depend, are being supported in their most violent kinds of policies. This is a political and human disaster. I don't see it likely to change in the near future. I see trust undermined by everything that Netanyahu does. It encourages people to believe that genocide is his goal, which it's not, but he's obviously killing a lot of people. And on the other side, Hamas's calls for throwing the Israelis into the Mediterranean and the support that gets from especially left-wing groups in Europe is not about to encourage any trust on the part of Israel. So we're at the worst possible situation. If one thinks about what you could do to improve things, let me step back and argue that a long-run solution to this conflict involves overcoming the negative dynamic that now exists. From the perspective of Israel, it's a security problem. Yet everything Israel does, or almost everything, to enhance its security undermines the self-esteem of Palestinians. From the Palestinian perspective, this is an issue, of nationalism, of trying to reassert some degree of solidarity and control over territory, and ultimately building self-esteem. Yet almost everything Palestinians do to build self-esteem threatens Israel's security. So the two sides are locked into this escalating dynamic that's brought them to this current mutual catastrophe. How do you disaggregate that? My sense is that it's not through trust. Trust is something that has to come later. Here, let me make a comparison to Egypt and Israel. There was a degree of trust that developed between Sadat and his Israeli interlocutors, and both had trust in the Americans as a third party, which brought about, how should I put this, a minimal agreement that avoided war and has proved effective over the decades. It hasn't led to any degree of trust between Israelis and Egyptians. Public opinion polls indicate that's still at a very low level. So when we talk about trust, we need to differentiate trust at a high level among leaders responsible for making decisions and trust among peoples, the kind, for example, that has now developed between French and Germans, which was unimaginable, I guess, in 1945. For this to happen, you have to have leaders who see the advantages of accommodation with the other side, as both Begin and Sadat did. None of the leaders in Israel and Palestine today feel that way. So we're at a standstill. Until that changes, there's no way you can build trust between leaders and active third parties. And without that, the conflict is still in its rawest, most violent stages.
Ned, the last subject I wanted to raise with you, apart from your new book, Why Nations Fight, first was the threat of trade conflicts with China. How should Europe balance its economic dependence on China with security and trust considerations? Is there a path forward that could prevent Europe from becoming collateral damage in a US-China trade war?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure the best person to give a response because international political economy is not one of my areas of research. That said, I'll make my answer very brief. It seems very likely, given Trump's appointments, that he is going to make all kinds of trade threats to China. And it seems likely, given Chinese feelings and calculus, that they're not going to give in. If this happens, then there is escalation, and everybody else is to some degree a victim of it. On the other hand, a quasi-trade war between the US and China also creates opportunities for everybody else. It may be that Europeans can increase their trade with both countries. And I wouldn't be surprised, and this happens when there are trade wars, that there will be people in Europe and elsewhere who launder both Chinese and American goods. So they go to the other country bypassing trade barriers. This is going to become a big problem.
If I'm not mistaken, Ned, you are in the process of writing or finished writing a new book called Why Nations Fight. Is that right?
Oh, it's Why Nations Still Fight.
Oh, so, Still Fight. Okay.
Yeah, in 2012, I published a book, Why Nations Fight. And this revisits the problem, but in a different way, with a very different kind of data set in which I look at both interventions and wars collectively. All of them fought since 1945. And unlike other books on war, these other studies look at war collectively. I break it down into types of war, arguing that the future likelihood of wars of each type varies enormously. And I go through, for example, colonial and post-colonial wars, which are sharply on the decline. The last of them was in 1990. On the other hand, we have the category of rump state wars, a rump state being a former empire or country that has lost much of its territory. And its people and leaders are keen to reclaim as much as they can. I mean, consider post-Versailles Germany as an example. Well, Russia's a rump state. And Putin's policies are designed as far as possible to make Russia great again, if I can use that phrase, and to be supported across the board politically in Russia. The retaking of Crimea met nearly universal support within Russia. So rump states are the category in which we can best fit the Russia-Ukraine war. The other category that is alive, and we were just talking about it, is partition states. So empires collapse, peoples within them claim national independence and states, and often have disputes with neighbors because they claim some of or all of the same territory. This has given us the two Irelands, divided Cyprus, Palestine and Israel, India and Pakistan, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. These are the most enduring conflicts of the 20th and now the 21st century. The only one that has really been put on hold and may be on the way to resolution is that of the two Irelands, and there are very specific reasons that makes that case different from the others now. And Palestine-Israel is obviously the one that's the most violent, but in the background is India and Pakistan.
Yeah, and would China and Taiwan fit in that category?
So now we come to another category called divided nations.
Oh, okay.
So divided nations were countries that had a long history of at least cultural and often political unity. The two Koreas, China, Taiwan, the two Germanys, the two Vietnams. And these have also been in the post-war period, and they're particular to the post-war period because they're all products of the Cold War. And they have been sources of wars, sources of superpower crises. China, Taiwan continues as a major flashpoint, as does the Korean Peninsula. And to understand these conflicts, each of these types has a different historical origin, and the likelihood of it becoming a hot war varies enormously. So I try to go through type by type and then look at what they have in common, because some of these categories overlap. Take the example of proxy war. Proxy war is when one or two outside countries support combatants in a conflict rather than fighting themselves. Or one of them does. So Iran is supporting the Houthis, and Hamas is fighting a proxy war with Israel. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States supported, respectively, Egypt and Israel. And their conflicts were, to some degree, proxy wars, as well as outgrowths of partition country conflicts. So the dynamics of these I try to analyze and to look at the way in which they've become more likely or less likely over time, and also the ways in which they interact, either to dampen or accelerate conflict.
Ned, my very last question. With rising nationalism and skepticism toward international alliances, how can leaders rebuild public trust in their decisions regarding foreign policy and alliances? Are there historical examples of leaders who successfully navigated such mistrust?
This is serious. I think that we're probably at the highest level of mistrust of governments in general in Europe, certainly in the post-war era. Across the board, countries that traditionally have had a fair degree of respect and trust for governments, like the United Kingdom or France, Germany in the post-war era, have now lost it, the United States. How you get this back requires governments to both deliver what populations see as needed, to be led by people who are able to arouse a degree of respect and sympathy on the part of publics, which current leaders do not in any way. And more fundamentally, they have to cope with the anger of publics. And that anger is not about to subside. And related to this, and especially true in the United States, the people who have the lowest trust in government are also the people who have the least information about it. So Americans all support Social Security. Most of them don't even know it's a government program. And the way around that is really only through education. And that's extremely difficult, and it's long-term in its consequences.
Ned, I'm sure there would be a lot more subjects we could discuss, but for the moment, I thank you very much for your insights. Is the new book, Why Nations, what was it again? Why Nations Still Fight, right?
That's my working title.
Okay.
John Haslam, my editor, may suggest something else.
And when is it about to be published?
Well, I'm just finishing a solid draft, so let's hope this time next year.
I'm looking forward to it, Ned. I wish you all the best.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye, Severin.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.